He controlled an empire that made grown men tremble at the sound of his name. Kwon Jae-hyun, the Phantom. A Korean mafia boss sitting at the top of a 9-figure shadow empire, surrounded by armed guards, surveillance cameras, and 12 staff members who had learned, very quickly, that in his house, silence was the only safe language. He had everything money could reach. A mansion of glass and concrete above Atlanta that looked like a declaration of war against ordinary life. A Patek Philippe on his wrist, a dragon tattooed up his neck, and absolutely no one in that house who dared look him directly in the eyes. But every single night, at some point between 2 and 4 in the morning, the most feared man on the East Coast woke up screaming. Doctors, psychiatrists, medication, a monk flown in from Seoul. Nothing worked. Nobody could reach him. Nobody even dared to try. Until her. Destiny. A 22-year-old black woman, honey skin, long black braids, working as his maid in a house where invisibility was survival. She had no power, no status, no reason to walk toward that door when she heard the sound coming from the end of the corridor that night. But she walked toward it anyway. And what happened next, inside that dark room, in the silence between a ruthless man and the one person he never expected to see him fall apart, changed everything for both of them, in ways that neither one of them saw coming. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There are men who are born into power, and men who build it with their hands. And then there are men who construct it out of survival, brick by brick, scar by scar, until the structure they have built is so large and so impenetrable that not even they can find the door anymore. Kwon Jae-hyun was the third kind, and on the surface, in every room he walked into, in every silence that fell when his name was spoken, he appeared to be the first. The mansion sat above Atlanta like a declaration, glass and dark concrete, all clean lines and deliberate coldness, designed to communicate exactly one thing to anyone who saw it from the road below: that the person living inside had nothing to prove and everything to protect. 12 staff members moved through its corridors with the careful, practiced silence of people who understood that in this house, invisibility was a form of self-preservation. 4 armed guards rotated at the entrance in 8-hour shifts. The cameras never blinked. And every single night, at some point between 2 and 4 in the morning, Kwon Jae-hyun woke up screaming. Not screaming the way people do in films, loud, theatrical, hands gripping sheets in some cinematic display of anguish. No, his was worse than that. It was the sound of a man trying not to make a sound. Controlled, compressed, suffocated. A scream that had nowhere to go and so turned inward, tightening around his chest like something with teeth. The staff heard it and said nothing. They had learned, the way people in dangerous proximity to powerful men always learn, that some things are not meant to be acknowledged out loud. He had tried everything that money could reach. The psychiatrist from Manhattan who billed $1,200 per session and spoke in careful, measured tones about trauma response and cortisol cycles. The medication. 3 different prescriptions, each one dimming something without fixing anything, leaving him foggy and distant during the days when he needed to be sharp and untouchable. The Buddhist monk his mother had flown in from Seoul, a quiet man with kind eyes who spent 3 days in the mansion performing rituals that filled the hallways with the scent of incense and low, steady chanting. He left on the fourth morning without explanation, and the housekeeper later noticed that the monk had not eaten anything during his entire stay. Nothing worked. What no one inside that house understood, what Kwon Jae-han himself had never been able to articulate, even in the sessions with the psychiatrist where he was expected to articulate everything, was that the problem was not the nightmares themselves. The nightmares were a symptom. They were the way his body had chosen, over years and years of compacted silence, to remind him of something he had buried so deep he no longer knew what it was. He only knew the shape of it, the weight, and the face. Always the same face. The face of a child he had never spoken of to anyone, that appeared every night without fail, and looked at him with an expression that was not accusatory or frightened, but simply, devastatingly, present. Destiny Caldwell had been working in the mansion for 46 days when she first heard the sound. She had been doing her final corridor check of the evening. Windows latched, hallway lights adjusted to their overnight setting, when it reached her from behind the closed door at the far end of the west wing. She stopped walking. She stood completely still in the middle of that dim, expensive corridor, with its dark hardwood floors and its framed abstract pieces that probably cost more than her mother's house. And she listened. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Then silence reclaimed the hall. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have. Her hand was at her side, fingers resting lightly against her thigh, the colorful beads of her bracelet pressing softly into her skin. She told herself it was not her business. She told herself that in a house like this one, the most dangerous thing a person could do was care about something that had not asked for her care. She told herself to walk back to her room. She stood there for another full minute, and then she walked toward the door. She knocked so softly that she was almost certain he would not hear it. Part of her hoped he wouldn't. Part of her had already constructed the exit. She would hear nothing, assume he was fine, and walk back down the corridor with her conscience intact and her employment secure. But the silence that followed her knock lasted only 3 seconds before his voice came through the door. Low and controlled and rough at the edges in the way that voices are when they have just been dragged back from somewhere dark. She pushed the door open slowly. The room was vast and dim, the city of Atlanta glittering 40 feet beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass like something that existed in another world entirely. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, the far edge, as though he had pulled himself there deliberately, away from the center of whatever had just happened in the middle of those sheets. His elbows were on his knees. His head was not quite bowed, but not quite raised. And he was shirtless, which meant the tattoos were visible. The black dragon coiling up the left side of his neck, the characters across his hands, the dense, elaborate ink that covered his arms like a second skin that he had chosen, unlike the first one, entirely for himself. He looked up at her without turning his full face toward her. His eyes were 2 points of absolute darkness in the ambient glow of the city light. She told him she had heard. She told him she was sorry. She asked, quietly, if he was all right. He looked at her for a long time, the kind of long that most people would have filled with something, an explanation, a deflection, a threat. He filled it with nothing. He simply looked at her the way a person looks at something unexpected that has appeared in a place they thought was entirely sealed. Then he told her to go to sleep. She went, but she lay in her room on the narrow bed with the polyester duvet that was the only thing in the mansion that wasn't expensive, and she stared at the ceiling, and she did not sleep for a very long time. What she could not have known, what she had no way of knowing, was that in the moment she had appeared in that doorway, something had shifted inside Kwon Jae-han. that he would spend the following days being unable to name. It was not attraction, not yet. It was something quieter and more confusing than that. It was the recognition that she had come, that she had heard the sound he always made when he thought no one could hear, and she had come to the door anyway. Not with a solution, not with professional distance or practiced sympathy. Just come. The way people used to come, he imagined, before he had made himself into something that people only approached when they had to. The next morning, he passed her in the hallway near the east staircase. She was carrying a stack of folded towels. He was on his way to a meeting that would determine the financial fate of 3 separate shell companies and a shipping arrangement that moved things across international waters that no customs officer would ever be permitted to inspect. He had 15 minutes before 2 men who feared him deeply would be waiting in his private office. He stopped walking. She stopped too, instinctively, the way all the staff did when he stopped, reading it as a potential instruction, a correction, something requiring their attention. He looked at her for just a moment, and then he said, simply, that he appreciated her checking. Last night. He appreciated it. She said it was no trouble at all. He nodded once and continued walking. Little did she know that those 6 words, "I appreciated you checking on me," were the closest thing to vulnerability that Kwon Jae-hyun had expressed to another human being in over 4 years. Little did she know that he had stood in the kitchen at 5:30 that morning, alone, rehearsing whether to say them at all, discarding a dozen different versions of the sentence before landing on those 6. Little did she know that the man who had just walked past her with his Patek Philippe and his dragon tattoo and his unhurried stride had spent 40 minutes deciding whether he was allowed to thank someone for caring. That night, the knock came to her door. Not his knock, one of the guards, expressionless, delivering the message in the flat tone of someone transmitting information rather than making a request. The boss wanted to see her. Not urgently, when she was ready. She set down the book she had been reading. She looked at her bracelet. She looked at the door. She got up. When she arrived at the West Wing, he was already standing in the open doorway of his room, not waiting inside, but at the threshold, arms loosely crossed, barefoot on the dark hardwood. The posture of a man who had decided something and was now committed to it, but had not yet fully made peace with having decided it. He told her he wanted her to stay in the room. Just sit. Just be there. He told her she didn't have to do anything. He told her there was a chair by the window. And she understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the particular intelligence of people who have spent their lives reading rooms, that this was not a strange request, that underneath all the money and the silence and the dragon on his neck, this was simply a man who did not know how to say, "I am afraid to close my eyes alone again tonight." She said it was fine. She went to the chair. The chair was not comfortable. It was beautiful. Dark leather, low arms, the kind of furniture that is selected for how it looks in a room rather than how it feels to sit in for hours. And within 20 minutes of settling into it, Destiny could feel the familiar ache beginning at the base of her neck. That particular tension that comes from holding a position the body was not designed to hold indefinitely. She shifted once, then again. She kept her phone face down on her knee after a while, having stopped pretending to scroll, and simply sat in the near dark and listened to the city outside the glass doing what cities do at night. Moving, humming, existing with complete indifference to what was happening inside this room. He had said very little after she sat down. He had moved to the bed, pulled back the dark sheet, and settled against the headboard rather than lying flat. the posture of someone not entirely willing to surrender to sleep, watching the ceiling with the focused attention of a man waiting for something to arrive that he knew was coming. She had not looked at him directly. It felt like the correct instinct, the same way you do not look directly at an animal you are trying not to startle. You make yourself part of the environment. You let the room adjust to you slowly. 20 minutes passed, then 30. His breathing changed. It did not become the deep, rhythmic breathing of sleep immediately. It moved through several stages first, each one a small negotiation, a quiet argument between the part of him that was exhausted and the part that had learned, over years of very good reasons, not to let its guard down completely. But somewhere around the 40-minute mark, the breathing settled. The room settled with it. And Destiny, watching the city lights blur slightly as her own eyes grew heavy, felt the particular stillness that descends on a space when the most tightly wound person in it has finally, reluctantly, let go. She did not mean to fall asleep. That was the honest truth of it. She had told herself she would stay awake, stay alert, remain in the role she had agreed to. Present but invisible. Helpful but professional, the way she had been trained to be in every room of this house, except now, apparently, this one. But the warmth of the room, and the soft, ambient glow of Atlanta, and the 46 days of careful, watchful, effortful work that had accumulated in her body, without her fully acknowledging the weight of it. All of it arrived at once, and she was asleep before she had finished deciding whether she was allowed to be. She slept in the chair for 4.5 hours. Kwon Chae-hun slept for 5. When he opened his eyes at 17 minutes to 6, the room was that specific shade of pre-dawn blue that exists for only a few minutes before the sun commits to rising. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself the way he always did when he woke, cataloging the room, the sounds, the light, the position of his body. And then, with the slow, careful awareness of someone discovering something fragile, he realized what was different. He had not woken in the night. Not once. He turned his head toward the chair. She was asleep against the window, her head tilted to one side, the long black braids of her hair falling forward across her shoulder and catching the early light in a way that made them look almost blue. The gold chain at her neck had slipped slightly to the side. Her hands were folded loosely in her lap, the colorful beads of her bracelet bright even in the low light. She looked entirely at peace in a chair that he knew, looking at it now with fresh eyes, was genuinely not built for sleeping in. He did not wake her. He got up slowly, moved to the other side of the room, and stood at the glass for a long time looking out at the city. Atlanta in the early morning was a different animal from Atlanta at night. Quieter, more honest, stripped of its ambitions for a few hours before it remembered what it was supposed to be. He watched it wake up. He felt something in his chest that he did not immediately try to analyze, which was itself unusual because analyzing was what he did with every sensation that arrived uninvited. He simply let it be there. When she stirred 20 minutes later and opened her eyes and saw him standing at the window, she sat up quickly with the instinct of someone who has been caught doing something. The particular guilt of a person whose entire professional existence depended on being appropriate, on being exactly where she was supposed to be and never an inch further. She started to apologize. He cut her off. Not harshly. He simply said her name. Just her name. And the way he said it made the apology feel unnecessary, like trying to return something that had already been given away. He asked her how the chair was. She said, honestly, that it had been terrible. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, The slight shift at the corner of his mouth, near the thin scar, the smallest possible concession to an expression he had long ago stopped allowing himself in front of other people. It was there for less than a second, but she saw it. That evening, she came back without being asked. He did not mention that she hadn't waited for the guard to knock. She did not explain it. She simply arrived at the threshold of the West Wing at the same time as the night before, and he was there, and the door was open, and she walked in and went to the chair without either of them saying a single word about what it meant that she had come on her own. The chair was still terrible. She sat in it for 30 minutes, listening to him settle, listening to the room find its quiet. And then, in the dark, with the city glowing soft and distant beyond the glass, Destiny Renee Caldwell made a decision that she would never be entirely able to explain. Not to anyone else, not entirely to herself. She stood up from the chair. She moved to the far side of the bed, the left side, the side farthest from him, the side closest to the window. She moved slowly, with the deliberate, held-breath carefulness of someone crossing a room full of things that could break. She reached down and lifted the edge of the heavy, dark duvet, just enough. She looked at the space beneath it. She looked at him, still, breathing, facing away from her toward the center of the room. And she got in. She lay on her back, completely rigid, her arms at her sides, her heart doing something loud and irrational inside her chest, staring at the ceiling with the focused intensity of someone waiting for a consequence. The duvet was heavy and warm and smelled like something expensive and clean. And underneath that, something else. Something just human enough to be disarming. She waited for him to move, to speak, to reach for the lamp, to say something in a voice that would end everything. He didn't move. His breathing continued. Steady, deep, undisturbed. She closed her eyes. And for the second night in a row, in the largest, loneliest room in the most fortified house in Buckhead, Kwon Jae-hun slept through the entire night without once waking up screaming. He knew before he opened his eyes. Not because he had felt her get in. He hadn't. Or if some part of him had registered the slight shift in the mattress, the barely perceptible change in the weight and warmth of the room, it had not been enough to pull him from the deepest sleep he had experienced in years. He knew because when he woke, at 6:43 in the morning, to the kind of slow and natural waking that he had almost forgotten existed, the kind without the jolt, without the face, without the sound tearing out of his chest before he could stop it, he was aware, even before he turned his head, that the room felt different. That something in the geometry of the space had changed overnight in a way that his body had registered and apparently decided, without consulting him, was acceptable. He turned his head slowly. She was on the far edge of the bed, as close to the side as a person could be without falling off it, lying on her back with her arms at her sides, in the rigid, careful posture of someone who had fallen asleep while trying very hard to take up as little space as possible. Her braids were spread across the white pillow. The gold chain had settled against her collarbone. Her face, in sleep, had released every careful, measured expression she wore during the day. The professional neutrality, the quiet watchfulness. And what remained underneath all of it was something so open and unguarded that he felt, looking at it, that he was seeing something he was not supposed to see. Not because it was wrong, but because it was real in a way that very little in his life ever was. He lay still and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The question he had never been able to answer, the one the psychiatrist had circled around for months with careful, expensive language, the one the medication had tried to chemically bypass, the one the monk had addressed with incense and prayer, had never actually been about the nightmares. The nightmares were a door. What was behind the door was this. He had not allowed himself to be in the presence of another human being without his armor on in so long that his body had begun to register the absence as a kind of emergency. Every night, alone in this vast and fortified room, some part of him that he had never managed to fully silence sounded the alarm. Not because of what he had done, not only because of the face that visited him in the dark, but because the fundamental human requirement of not being entirely alone, of having, at some point in the long, dark hours between midnight and morning, another breathing body nearby, had gone unmet for so long that his nervous system had begun to treat sleep itself as a threat. She had not fixed him. He understood that clearly, lying there in the early morning light, while Atlanta resumed its noise outside the glass. She had not healed anything, or resolved anything, or made the things he carried any lighter. She had simply been present. Quietly, stubbornly, without agenda or performance, she had inserted herself into the room and refused, in her own gentle and completely undramatic way, to be anywhere else. And his body, that traitorous, exhausted, perpetually vigilant body that no amount of discipline had ever fully brought to heel, had responded to it the way a locked room responds to the right key. Not with drama, just with the soft, inevitable sound of something opening. She woke while he was still looking at the ceiling. He heard the small catch in her breath that meant she had remembered where she was. The split second of recalibration, the rapid assembly of context. He turned his head at the same moment she turned hers. They looked at each other across the wide, white expanse of the bed in the early morning light, and neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. He had prepared nothing. That was the truth. Kwon Jae-hyun, who prepared everything, who had contingency plans for his contingency plans, who had never in his adult life walked into a room without knowing exactly what he intended to say and exactly what response he was prepared to handle, had absolutely nothing ready for this moment. He had no framework for it, no protocol, no precedent in his own experience to reference. So he did the only thing available to him. He got up and made her coffee. She found him in the kitchen when she came downstairs 20 minutes later, still in her rosé pajamas, her braids slightly disheveled, the moon pendant catching the morning light. He was standing at the counter with 2 cups. The kitchen was enormous and largely symbolic. He rarely used it himself, but he had clearly figured out enough of it to produce something that, when she took the first sip, was exactly as strong and exactly as dark as she would have made it herself. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. He told her he paid attention. She asked him when. He said always. She didn't know what to do with that. So she took another sip and looked out the window at the garden, where the sprinklers had just come on, moving in slow arcs across the grass in the early light. He said her name. She looked at him. He said that he didn't know what this was. He said it plainly, without apology, the way a man states a fact he has already fully accepted. I don't know what this is, but I know that I have not slept like that in 8 years. And I know that the reason is you. And I know that I am not willing to pretend otherwise. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sprinklers moved. Atlanta traffic was beginning to build its morning density somewhere beyond the walls. She told him that she had grown up learning to take care of people, that it was the thing she did best, and the thing she had never once in her life turned toward herself. She told him that she had walked into his room that first night not because it was her job, but because she could not hear someone suffering and do nothing. That it was a flaw, probably, that had gotten her into trouble before and would probably get her into trouble again. He asked her if she thought this was trouble. She looked at him for a long time, at the dragon on his neck, at the scar at the corner of his mouth, at the eyes that everyone looked away from, and that were, this morning, in this kitchen, looking at her with something in them that she recognized because she had felt it herself, and had spent 22 years not knowing what to do with it. She said she thought it was the most honest thing that had happened to her in a long time. He set his cup down on the counter. She set hers down beside it. The space between them in that kitchen was not large. It was, in fact, exactly the distance between two people who have already made a decision and are simply waiting for the moment to catch up with them. Little did either of them know that the mansion's 12 staff members would arrive for their morning shifts within the hour. Little did they know that the guards would rotate at the entrance at 7 sharp. Little did they know that the phones would start ringing and the meetings would resume, and the world that Kwon Jae-hyun had built around himself would reassemble itself with its usual relentless efficiency and demand his full attention before the morning was out. But in this moment, in this specific, unrepeatable moment in an expensive kitchen in Buckhead, while the sprinklers moved outside and the city woke up around them, none of that had arrived yet. There was only this: 2 people standing close enough to feel the warmth of each other. One of them learning, for the first time in years, that survival and living were not the same thing. The other learning, for the first time in her life, that taking care of someone and being taken care of were not mutually exclusive. That you could do both at once with the same person. And that this was not weakness on either side, but something rarer and more valuable than anything in the house surrounding them. He reached out and touched the moon pendant at her collarbone. Just the pendant. Just for a moment. With the kind of gentleness that feels impossible in a man whose hands have done the things his hands have done. She let him. Outside, Atlanta kept moving. The sprinklers finished their arc and went still. Somewhere in the house, a door opened, one of the early staff beginning their rounds, and the sound of footsteps on hardwood drifted faintly toward the kitchen. Neither of them moved. Not yet. Destiny spent her whole life taking care of everyone around her. She walked into dark rooms when no one asked her to. She stayed when leaving would have been easier. She gave her presence, her warmth, her calm, to someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. But here's the question nobody asks about women like Destiny. Who was taking care of her? Because that same woman, the one who showed up for everyone else without a second thought, had probably been ignoring her own skin for years, watching dark spots build, feeling her glow slowly disappear after 45, trying product after product that was never made for her. And not because she didn't deserve better, because nobody ever taught her the truth about her own skin. That mature black skin has a different biology. That melanin reacts to inflammation in ways lighter skin simply doesn't. That after 45, collagen drops fast, and most skincare products ignore that completely. That there are specific Korean ingredients, backed by science, that were practically made for skin like hers. The guide on your screen right now is for women like Destiny. Women who have spent a lifetime pouring into others and are finally ready to pour into themselves. Korean Glass Skin Secrets for Black women 45 and over. Your skin has been waiting for this. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or find the link in the description below. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been the person in the room with the least power, and yet the only one willing to show up for someone who needed it? Have you ever watched someone hide their pain behind everything they had built and recognized that loneliness because you had felt it too? And have you ever discovered that the bravest thing you can do for another person is simply stay? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about humanity, healing, and unexpected love, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.